There is a particular kind of television show that comes along once in a generation and refuses to behave the way television is supposed to behave. MASH was that show. It premiered on CBS on September 17, 1972, set during the Korean War of the early 1950s but speaking unmistakably to the Vietnam War that American audiences were living through in real time, and it proceeded across 11 seasons to do things that nobody in network television had thought to do before. Kill beloved characters without warning, film episodes without laugh tracks, use comedy as a vehicle for grief so genuine that millions of viewers cried during a sitcom as a matter of routine. The show that began as an irreverent service comedy about army surgeons keeping their sanity through pranks and drinking became, season by season, one of the most morally serious dramas American television had ever produced. That transformation was not painless. It required the show to outgrow certain actors and certain characters, and it required certain actors to recognize that the show had moved past what they could offer it, or past what it could offer them. The departures from MASH across its 11-year run are not simply stories of contract disputes and creative disagreements. They are stories about what happens when a piece of art becomes something more ambitious than anyone involved originally signed up for. The literary and cinematic origins of the show established from the beginning that this was material with more weight than its premise suggested. H. Richard Hornberger, a surgeon who served in a mobile army surgical hospital during the Korean War, published a fictionalized account of that experience under the pen name Richard Hooker in 1968, and the novel's specific combination of dark humor and genuine human warmth caught Hollywood's attention almost immediately. Robert Altman directed the 1970 film adaptation, casting Donald Sutherland and Elliot Gould as the central duo and producing a work of satirical black comedy that won the Palme d'Or at the Cannes Film Festival and an Academy Award for Best Adapted Screenplay. The film resonated with a country exhausted by Vietnam and deeply suspicious of military authority, and its success made the case for a television adaptation that CBS and producers Larry Gelbart and Gene Reynolds developed into the weekly series that debuted in 1972. Alan Alda was cast as Hawkeye Pierce, the central protagonist, and his interpretation of the character, sardonic, politically engaged, emotionally available in ways that male television leads were not typically permitted to be, would eventually shape the entire direction of the series. The show struggled in its first season with ratings low enough that CBS nearly canceled it before making the decision to move it to Saturday nights, where its audience found it and responded with a sustained loyalty that would eventually make the MASH finale in February 1983 the most watched single television broadcast in American history at that time, drawing an audience of approximately 106 million viewers. But the road from the uncertain first season to that extraordinary conclusion required a series of cast changes that each told their own story about the relationship between creative ambition and individual professional need. McLean Stevenson was there from the beginning, playing Colonel Henry Blake, the commanding officer of the 4077th MASH unit, and his performance in the show's early seasons earned him a Golden Globe Award and genuine audience affection. The character was a specific kind of comedy archetype, the confused but fundamentally well-meaning authority figure, more comfortable with fishing and correspondence with his wife than with the military responsibilities his rank technically imposed on him, and Stevenson played him with an easy warmth that gave the show a human center during its first seasons when the comic rhythms were still being established. What Stevenson also was, by his own account expressed in interviews during the period, was a man with a specific set of professional ambitions that MASH was not going to satisfy. He told People magazine in 1975, with a directness that subsequent events would render poignant, that he wanted to carry a show, to be the person the entire production revolved around rather than a contributing member of an ensemble. He saw the television landscape and believed he had the ability and the charisma to anchor his own program, and he decided that remaining at MASH meant trading that ambition for a comfortable supporting position in someone else's story. At the end of season 3, Stevenson informed the producers he would not be returning. The decision he made about his departure was theirs, and it was bold in a way that nobody in network television had attempted before with a beloved character. Rather than writing Henry Blake out through the conventional mechanisms available to television writers, producers Larry Gelbart and Gene Reynolds decided that his exit would serve the show's larger purpose. The war setting that MASH had been using largely as a backdrop for comedy would assert itself as the show's actual subject. In the season 3 finale, titled Abyssinia, Henry Blake receives his discharge papers and prepares to return home to his family in Bloomington, Illinois. The episode builds through 25 minutes of celebration, emotional farewells, and genuine joy, positioning itself as a happy conclusion to his arc. In the final scene, Radar enters the operating room where surgery is ongoing and delivers a message that the actor Gary Berghoff later said he was one of the only cast members told about in advance so he could prepare himself emotionally. The message was that Lieutenant Colonel Henry Blake's plane had been shot down over the Sea of Japan and that there were no survivors. The reactions from the cast in that scene were substantially genuine. Most of them had not been told the ending until that take. The silence that followed, underscored by nothing but the sounds of the operating room, represented something American television had simply never done before. CBS received thousands of letters in the days following the broadcast, some praising the show's honesty about what war actually costs, others expressing anger that a beloved character could be taken away so completely. Gelbart later explained the decision in terms that captured the show's entire moral project. They wanted to say that not everyone gets to go home. Stevenson's post-MASH career did not produce the solo stardom he had envisioned. The McLean-Stevenson Show, a family sitcom built around his comedic persona, ran for one season on NBC and was cancelled. Hello Larry, a second attempt to find a vehicle that could center on his particular strengths, was critically dismissed and became better remembered as an example of failed network television than as a meaningful work in its own right. In a 1983 interview with the Los Angeles Times, Stevenson acknowledged that he had taken himself out of something exceptional and had not found anything to replace it. He continued working in television through guest appearances and smaller projects until his death in February 1996 at the age of 68, and the tributes that followed from his former castmates emphasized what they had valued in him as a colleague and a person. Alan Alda described him as a wonderful actor and a good man. Gary Berghoff, who had shared scenes with him throughout those first 3 seasons, remembered him as someone who brought lightness and joy into the working environment. The final irony of Stevenson's departure is that the character of Henry Blake became more significant in leaving than he ever was in his presence. The manner of his exit gave MASH its soul in a way that the character's continued existence never could have. Wayne Rogers's departure at the end of the same season, Season 3, shared certain surface similarities with Stevenson's and differed in almost every particular beneath that surface. Rogers played Trapper John McIntyre, Hawkeye's best friend and co-conspirator, and the chemistry he and Alda established across the show's first 3 years formed the foundation of MASH's early identity. The two characters functioned as a unit, equally irreverent, equally committed to medicine, equally determined to maintain their humanity within an institution designed to suppress it, and their friendship gave the comedy its specific texture of warmth beneath the satire. But Rogers, like Stevenson, had arrived at the show with certain assumptions about what the ensemble structure would look like, and those assumptions did not survive contact with the reality of how the series developed. As Alda became more creatively involved, writing episodes, directing, and shaping the show's increasingly serious moral and political engagement, Hawkeye's character absorbed corresponding depth and centrality, while Trapper John's role remained essentially static. Rogers later described the experience in interviews with a specificity that communicated genuine professional frustration rather than simple ego. Trapper had gone from being a co-lead to being the person who nodded in agreement with what Hawkeye said, and that reduction was not something Rogers felt he could continue accepting. His exit was quieter than Stevenson's in its mechanics but more dramatic in its institutional consequences. Rogers had never formally signed his contract. He had been working throughout his 3 seasons on what amounted to a handshake agreement, and when the producers threatened legal action after he declined to return for Season 4, they had no legal basis for the threat. He simply did not come back, and the production was informed so close to the beginning of filming on the new season that the writers had to construct an explanation for Trapper John's absence on extremely short notice. The character was written out through a brief explanation delivered in the first episode of Season 4. Hawkeye returns from leave to learn that Trapper has received his discharge and already gone home, without ceremony or farewell. The audience's reaction was strongly negative, compounded by the Henry Blake death that had preceded it. 2 of the show's central characters had now disappeared, one killed and one simply absent, and the series that viewers had built their affection around no longer existed in the form they had known. Mike Farrell stepped into the replacement role as B.J. Honeycutt, a character written to be warmer, more emotionally complex, and more suited to the introspective direction the show was taking, and within a few seasons many viewers would consider the later configuration of the ensemble superior to the original. Rogers himself went on to a career that moved substantially away from acting. He studied history at Princeton and built a successful second career as a financial investor and media commentator, eventually becoming a regular presence on Fox News as a business and economics analyst. He and Alda maintained their friendship, and Alda's tribute after Rogers's death in December 2015 at the age of 82 captured something genuine about what their professional relationship had actually meant to both of them. Gary Berghoff's departure in Season 8 came from an entirely different source of difficulty than the professional ambitions that had driven Stevenson and Rogers away. Berghoff had created the character of Corporal Walter O'Reilly, universally known as Radar, with a specificity and an emotional intelligence that made the character irreplaceable in the show's early and middle years. Radar was the unit's company clerk, a young man from a farm in Iowa who possessed an almost supernatural sensitivity to the world around him, who could hear incoming helicopters before anyone else in the camp, and whose fundamental innocence provided the emotional baseline against which the war's cruelty was measured. Berghoff was the only cast member of the television series who had also appeared in the 1970 Robert Altman film, and the continuity he provided gave the show a connection to its origins that had genuine artistic value. His performance across 7 seasons earned him an Emmy Award. He was also nominated 6 additional times, and his standing among the cast was secure. What was not secure was his well-being. He has spoken openly in subsequent interviews about struggles with anxiety and depression that the show's demanding production schedule exacerbated significantly, and about the specific cost of spending so much time away from his family during his daughter's early years, a cost he has described as a regret that remained with him long after his departure. He reached a point where the professional rewards of continuing, considerable as they were, could not outweigh what continuing was asking of him personally, and he informed the producers that season 7 would be his last. The farewell the show gave Radar across a 2-part episode titled Goodbye. Radar was among the most emotionally accomplished pieces of television MASH ever produced. The character's departure was framed through his family needing him home on their Iowa farm, and the final image, Radar walking away from the camp, silhouetted against the Korean sky, his childhood teddy bear left behind on Hawkeye's bunk as evidence that the boy who had arrived at the war had become someone slightly different through the experience of it, achieved the specific kind of emotional resonance that distinguishes art from entertainment. After MASH, Berghoff stepped largely back from the entertainment industry, investing his attention in painting, wildlife conservation, and various inventive projects. He later explained his departure in terms that were clear about his priorities, his family and his own recovery from burnout, and the simplicity of that explanation carried more dignity than any more complicated account could have. Larry Linville's decision to leave the show at the end of season 5 involved a different kind of professional self-awareness. He had played Major Frank Burns, the self-important, hypocritical, by-the-rules antagonist whose combination of vanity and incompetence made him the comic villain the early series required, with a technical precision that made the character far more interesting than the role required. Linville was a classically trained actor with substantially more range than Frank Burns ever demanded of him, and by season 5 he had reached the conclusion that he had done everything the character could do. Frank Burns was not a character who could grow. His function was to embody a certain kind of institutional mediocrity and moral flexibility that the show needed to satirize, and that function did not evolve in the way that other characters' arcs evolved. Linville chose to leave on his own terms, before the character became a liability to the show's increasingly serious ambitions, and his departure opened creative space that the series filled brilliantly with the introduction of David Ogden Stiers as Major Charles Emerson Winchester III, a character who served a superficially similar antagonist function but who brought genuine complexity, genuine intelligence, and eventually genuine pathos to his role as a Boston Brahmin aristocrat confronting the democratic chaos of a war zone that his cultivation had not prepared him for. Stiers remained with the show through its conclusion in 1983 and declined the invitation to continue the characters in the Aftermath spin-off, explaining that Winchester had completed what he needed to do. He came out publicly as gay in a 2009 interview and was remembered after his death in 2018 at the age of 75 as someone who had brought extraordinary intelligence and dignity to everything he appeared in. Through all of these departures and arrivals, Loretta Swit remained, one of only 4 cast members to appear in both the pilot episode and the 2.5-hour finale. Her portrayal of Major Margaret Houlihan across 11 seasons represented one of the most sustained and deliberate character transformations in American television history, as she worked consistently against the show's initial framing of Margaret as a comic foil and romantic target to develop her into a fully realized professional whose commitment to her patients was as serious as anyone's in the unit. The character who began as a punchline became, through Swit's advocacy and the show's maturing willingness to take her seriously, one of its most complex human portraits. That she was the one who stayed while others sought different opportunities says something meaningful about what MASH meant to the people who made it, that for some of them, the work itself was reason enough to remain, even as the show became something considerably more demanding than what any of them had originally imagined they were signing up for.